A legacy under scrutiny, US policy in the Middle East. This policy has been a subject of intense debate and analysis for decades, with each administration bringing its own approach and priorities to the table. The United States' involvement in the Middle East has been long and complex. From the early 20th century, when oil was discovered, to the present day, the US has played a pivotal role in shaping the region's political and economic landscape. It is a story fraught with contradictions, unintended consequences, and tragic outcomes. The US has often found itself caught between competing interests and ideologies, leading to policies that have sometimes backfired. From the early days of oil exploration to the post-9/11 era, US policy has been marked by a series of interventions, alliances, and miscalculations. The quest for energy security and geopolitical influence has driven many of these decisions. Today, as the region grapples with instability, violence, and political upheaval, the legacy of US involvement is facing intense scrutiny. The consequences of past actions are still being felt, and the region remains a focal point of global attention. Critics argue that US policies have often exacerbated existing tensions, fueled extremism, and undermined long-term stability. They point to numerous instances where US actions have led to unintended and often disastrous outcomes. From propping up authoritarian regimes to pursuing regime change through military force, the US has left an indelible mark on the region's political landscape. These actions have often been justified in the name of promoting democracy and stability, but the results have been mixed at best. The human cost of these policies has been immense, measured in countless lives lost, millions displaced, and widespread suffering. The impact on ordinary people has been profound, with many still struggling to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of conflict. While proponents argue that the US has played a vital role in promoting security and stability in the region, the evidence suggests otherwise. The rise of extremist groups, ongoing conflicts, and humanitarian crises all point to the failures of US policy. The rise of terrorist groups like ISIS, the persistence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the ongoing humanitarian crises in Syria and Yemen all point to the failures of US policy. These issues continue to pose significant challenges for the region and the world. As the Middle East continues to be a region of vital strategic importance, the US must engage in a critical and honest assessment of its past actions. This involves not only acknowledging past mistakes, but also understanding the complex dynamics that drive the region's politics and conflicts. Only then can it hope to develop a more effective and ethical approach to the region, one that prioritizes diplomacy, human rights, and sustainable peace. The future of US policy in the Middle East will depend on its ability to learn from the past and adapt to the changing realities of the region. A century of engagement, from oil to Cold War rivalries. The story of US involvement in the Middle East is a complex tapestry woven with threads of economic ambition, geopolitical strategy, and military intervention. US involvement in the Middle East dates back to the early 20th century, driven by growing economic and strategic interests. American businessmen and oil companies saw the region as a treasure trove of untapped resources, ripe for exploration and exploitation. The discovery of vast oil reserves in the region sparked a scramble for access and control, with American companies playing a prominent role. These companies not only sought to extract oil, but also to establish a foothold in the region's burgeoning energy market. This economic imperative soon intertwined with emerging geopolitical concerns. As the world entered the Cold War era, the Middle East's strategic importance grew exponentially. Following World War II, the Middle East became a key battleground in the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union vied for influence, each seeking to expand their ideological and political reach in the region. The US sought to contain Soviet influence by forging alliances with regional powers, often overlooking their human rights records and democratic deficits. This pragmatic approach was seen as necessary to counter the perceived threat of communism. This approach led to a pattern of supporting autocratic regimes deemed vital to US interests. These alliances were often controversial, as they involved backing leaders who suppressed dissent and ruled with an iron fist. The Eisenhower Doctrine, announced in 1957, solidified this policy by pledging American support to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. This doctrine was a clear signal of the US commitment to maintaining its influence in the region. This doctrine, along with the subsequent Nixon Doctrine, shaped US involvement for decades, emphasizing military aid and security guarantees over promoting democracy and human rights. The focus was on stability and containment, often at the expense of democratic principles. This period also saw the US become deeply enmeshed in the Arab-Israeli conflict, providing unwavering support to Israel, while struggling to mediate a lasting peace agreement. The US played a dual role, acting as both a staunch ally of Israel and a mediator in the peace process. The 1967 Six-Day War, which resulted in Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, further complicated the situation, creating a volatile status quo that persists to this day. The war had far-reaching consequences, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East and setting the stage for ongoing conflicts and negotiations. The devil's bargain, supporting autocrats for strategic gains. A defining feature of US policy in the Middle East has been its willingness to prioritize strategic interests over democratic values. This has often translated into supporting authoritarian regimes, perceived as allies in the fight against communism during the Cold War and later against terrorism. The rationale was often presented as a devil's bargain, a necessary evil to maintain stability and secure vital resources. However, this approach had disastrous consequences, entrenching dictatorships, stifling dissent, and fueling resentment against the US. Examples abound. From propping up the Shah of Iran in the 1950s and 1960s to providing billions of dollars in military aid to Egypt under Hosni Mubarak, the US consistently prioritized stability over democracy. This short-sighted approach ignored the long-term consequences of supporting repressive regimes, ultimately creating breeding grounds for instability and extremism. The Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 exposed the flaws in this strategy. Decades of pent-up frustration with authoritarian rule and a lack of economic opportunity erupted across the region. The US was caught off guard, struggling to reconcile its support for long-standing allies with the aspirations of people demanding change. A Gordian knot, the intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This conflict, deeply rooted in history, religion and politics, has been a focal point of international concern for decades. No issue better exemplifies the failures of US policy in the Middle East than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Despite numerous attempts at mediation and peace talks, the US has struggled to find a path to lasting peace. For decades, the US has positioned itself as an honest broker in the peace process, yet a lasting solution remains elusive. The complexity of the conflict, with its deep-seated grievances and historical injustices, has made it a challenging issue for any mediator. While providing unwavering support to Israel, the US has failed to hold it accountable for its continued expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank, a violation of international law and a major obstacle to peace. These settlements have not only altered the geography, but also the demographics of the region, making the prospect of a contiguous Palestinian state increasingly difficult. The Oslo Accords, signed in 1993, offered a glimmer of hope, but ultimately failed to deliver on their promise of a two-state solution. The initial optimism was soon overshadowed by mutual distrust and unfulfilled commitments from both sides. The collapse of the Camp David summit in 2000 and the subsequent Second Intifada further dimmed prospects for peace. The violence and unrest that followed only deepened the divide, making reconciliation seem even more distant. The US has often been accused of bias towards Israel, hindering its ability to act as an effective mediator. This perceived partiality has eroded trust among Palestinians and other Arab nations, complicating diplomatic efforts. The Trump administration's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and relocate the US embassy there further inflamed tensions and undermined the peace process. This move was seen by many as a unilateral endorsement of Israeli claims, disregarding Palestinian aspirations for East Jerusalem as their capital. As the conflict festers, so too does the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where millions of Palestinians live under Israeli blockade, subject to recurring cycles of violence and deprivation. The blockade has led to severe shortages of essential goods, medical supplies, and has crippled the economy, exacerbating the suffering of the civilian population. The US bears a moral and political responsibility to break this impasse and work towards a just and lasting solution for both Israelis and Palestinians. This requires a balanced approach that addresses the legitimate concerns and aspirations of both sides, fostering an environment where peace can take root and flourish. Only through sustained and genuine efforts can the cycle of violence and mistrust be broken, paving the way for a future where both peoples can coexist in peace and security.